So today I want to go back a little bit to our idea of mirrors and that reflections. Because it fits really nicely with the release and renewal we've been talking about. And the mirror for today is the mirror of judgment, which dovetails nicely into our daily word of forgiveness, because you really can't talk about one without the other, especially since the mirror deals with the way we deal with judgment in our lives, not so much what things are happening in the world. So the idea is, whatever we see that triggers us in some way, right? And this would happen more than once. So we know that the universe, to get our attention, we usually see something more than once in a short amount of time, in a space of time. And that is maybe what we are being called to look at in the moment. Matthew 7, 1 through 5 talks about judgment. And Jesus talks about how we can recognize the tiny little speck of dust in somebody's eyelash, but not recognize what's poking us real strongly. And I know sometimes we read that and it's like, well, just don't judge others. Don't judge others. But it's like, what is it that we're judging and how is that working in us? And that's really what the Essenes call attention to through passages like that, is what are we judging in the moment? What situations, what people are showing us what we have a charge on, and what we maybe need to forgive and heal within ourselves. So it's not always a like or a don't like, because everybody has likes and don't likes. That doesn't automatically turn them into judgments, right? So it's separate than that. Again, it reflects what's in us at a particular moment in time and what we're ready to look at. So those that express, and then hatred or something is worthy or unworthy, or something is worthy of being saved or not saved, or to be alive or not to be alive. Those things fall into the judgment category. When we put stark lines on situations, Dr. Brian Weiss talks about if we find ourselves really not liking judging something, he says that is exactly what you will experience if you choose to come back for another round of humanity. He says, so take care of it now, or you're going to have a whole lifetime to take care of it. Whether that's totally true or not, I don't know, but I like the idea that he expresses that, to recognize those things about us now, as much as we can. So for me, as I'm working through these mirrors, and one of the reasons I chose to talk about the mirrors for Lent is because I found myself really working with them, especially over the past year. And I found myself for judgment actually being triggered by people who I recognize are judgers. Now, isn't that kind of ironic? So every time I felt this thing inside that said, and I started to recognize that as judgment, right? That it was always dealing with somebody that I thought or recognized as being very judgy. And those things kept coming up over and over and over. People that I interact with online, people, and you guys know I have different groups that I work with spiritually online, and then some of them coming forward and just wrecking each other because of a point of view. And I'm like, how can we be in a spiritual community and wreck each other over a point of view? And to wrestle with that and realize that not only is that something we all need to work on, but in that moment, it was showing me how much I judge that activity in others. So, again, it's calling us to see and everybody's different. Everybody has some kind of trigger, right? And what is being triggered in you at any given time. And again, mine were things like hearing violent words towards each other, recognizing bullying, and then putting those actions and then tossing those people aside and, well, they're in this category now. And yet, we're all individuals, right? We all have these pluses and minuses we're all working with. So then what do we do with that? What do we do with that? And then for me, it was, well, what is it that's triggering? So if we look at it and we realize what we're judging, the idea is there's something in us that maybe we haven't fully looked at to forgive and or heal, and what is that? So if in sitting with that, for me, I'll just use myself as an example so that you can try it on your own for your own examples. But for me, it was recognizing all the times that I felt judged because of a label or a preconception or a package, something that was out front, and then I got put into a category. So for me, through my life, I'm a short person, right? So that puts me in a category of, and being short and female and blonde put me in a whole other category that was often, maybe you don't know what you're talking about. And then to look younger than what I am on top of it always put me in another category. So I would go places, not as much lately now that he's married, but I'd go places with my oldest son and they would peg me as his girlfriend and defer to him with everything. And he finally recognized that one day. He had this little, and he stopped the person. He says, you know what? She's the one in charge. She's my mom. So cut it out. But the idea that this short little person is walking around with a 6 foot tall person who looks a little older than what he is, right? There was this preconceived idea. But that was something that, started very young in my life. For whatever reason, then that kind of mirrored back to me. And then also being told that maybe I didn't have a realistic view of the world. I have too much of a positive outlook, or you don't know what's really going on. Especially when I'd write papers at school and somebody close to me or a family member would read it, or my thesis, something that we all know. You work 10 weeks on something, you kind of know where you fit in a topic, and yet to be dismissed. And then some of the biggest ones, though, were in religious institutions, where because of my life choices and of 2 marriages and 2 sets of children and all of that, I was told by religious leaders that I had no right to either teach there or even approach the altar, that there was something wrong with me there. So all of these judgments, right? And it's stuff that you think you fluff off. You think that you just grow past. And yet in sitting with how I was recognizing other people judging, I realized those times that I recognized it coming my way had stuck more than maybe I wanted to believe. So there's a healing process then that takes place. Once you recognize it, you get a chance to forgive that situation. You get to send healing and compassion and blessings to that part of your life. And then slowly, the coolest part is we recognize that maybe we wouldn't have changed those moments at all, because it helps us be more compassionate with others in similar situations, or even to recognize how that affects how we interact with each other, and then choose to change it or not. We get choices from our life experiences. There's a gentleman by the name of Andrew Solomon. He is a researcher, a writer. He's got some amazing work on family, the way people interact with each other, depression, forgiveness, all kinds of stuff. I'd strongly suggest looking him up. There was an article that I read of his this past week that's called The Shape of Love. And Andrew has this really unique ability to take these what we would consider outside societal norm, right? People, situations, and interview those people and bring together these books and this recognition that they are, working on the same things everybody else is, and kind of taking away that layer of, well, they're different or they're in a category or whatever. And this particular article was about polyamorous and polygamous. And I know when people hear those words, there's like this, what? And yet there's, with anything, when we look at what's really going on in the individual, right? And we take away this layer of that's either good or bad, we see the humanity in there, right? And that, yes, and with any category, there's going to be people that abuse situations. It doesn't matter who we are or where we're at. There's going to be somebody that takes it a little too far. And yet, is that really what's happening for that whole category of person? And so it's really, really neat the way he is able to talk about and interview and share these stories and bring those to people and say, you know what, everybody has a story and everybody is a people, and start to peel away the way we judge each other. So he interviews families, he redefines really the idea of what an ideal family is or an ideal situation. He's even talked to families that have tragedies like raising the children that were the killers in places like Columbine or Sandy Brook, and says, these are real families dealing with real emotions and real issues, and yet sometimes we throw them again in the judgment pile. What part of that are we seeing in ourselves? He talks about how studies show how cultural viewpoints shift over time. So the things that we find that we're being triggered with, the more we learn, the more we educate ourselves, the more we sit with it in that caring and compassion and forgiveness, it shifts. So things like homosexuality being seen as an illness, as late as the 60s, 1960s, now is recognized as a legitimate, way to live, and gay marriage has been legalized. And that's a shift over time of viewpoints in the way we judge one thing or another. Same thing with people like with Down syndrome. At one time, again, not so far away, in the 1960s, there were papers written about how these children could just be placed in institutions, or there was even advocacy of euthanizing Down syndrome babies in that time period, because they were, some people that were advocating for that did not see them as people. And now today we're like, what are you talking about? This is absolutely ridiculous way to think. How can we judge somebody in that way? And yet it took time. It took time and recognition and people willing to talk to each other and understand and care for that. So the idea is we do that for ourselves as much as we recognize it happening in society, and stripping away those layers of judgment on each other. And and that list goes on: physical and mental differences, abilities, the way we view hardships from one person to another. We've had adaptations in schools and in institutions to deal with a myriad of our differences now, recognizing that those differences don't mean less or more, but combined they make us stronger, learning from each other. So these preconceived judgments can change. And if they can change in society, even though it looks like it takes a really long time, right? They can change within us and the way we take care of ourselves. Parents of children with all these, we'll call them differences, Solomon calls them horizontal identities. So he says there's vertical identities and there's horizontal identities. So the vertical ones are these big ones, like what country you're in, maybe what category you're put in because of the way you choose to worship, or things like that. That those are big, broader terms. He said then the horizontal ones are the things that might be smaller but can still create community. Things like deafness and dwarfism and Down syndrome and autism, and list goes on and on and on. So I just want to so horizontal identities, because I'm going to read a passage from one of his books where he uses that term, so you know where it's coming from. I really think it brings together all of these thoughts. He says, "I'd wish I'd been accepted sooner and better when I was younger. Not being accepted made me enraged. But now I am not inclined to dismantle my history. We choose our own lives. It is not simply that we decide on the behaviors that construct our own experience. When given our own druthers, we elect to be ourselves. Most of us would like to be more successful or more beautiful or wealthier, and most endure episodes of low self-esteem or even self-hatred. We despair 100 times a day, but we retain the startling evolutionary imperative for the fact of ourselves. And with that splinter of grandiosity, we redeem our flaws. These parents have, by and large, chosen to love. Their children, and many of them, have chosen to value their own lives, even though they carry what much of the world considers an intolerable burden. Children with horizontal identities alter yourself painfully. They also illuminate it. They are receptacles for rage and joy, even for salvation. When we love them, we achieve above all else the rapture of privileging what exists over what we have merely imagined. A follower of the Dalai Lama, who had been imprisoned by Chinese for decades, was asked if he had ever been afraid in jail. And he said that his fear was that he would lose compassion for his captors. Parents often think that they've captured something small and vulnerable, but the parents I've profiled here have been captured, locked up with their children's madness or genius or deformity, and the quest is never to lose compassion. A Buddhist scholar once explained to me that most Westerners mistakenly think nirvana is what you arrive at when your suffering is over, and only an eternity of happiness stretches ahead. But such bliss would always be shadowed by the sorrow of the past and would therefore be imperfect. Nirvana occurs when you not only look forward to the rapture, but also a gaze back into the times of anguish, and you find in them the seeds of your joy. You may not have felt that happiness at the time, but in retrospect, it is inevitable. For some parents of children with horizontal identities, acceptance reaches its apogee when parents conclude that while they suppose that they were struck by a great and catastrophic loss of hope, they were, in fact, falling in love with someone they didn't yet know enough to want. As such, parents look back. They see how every stage of loving their child has enriched them in ways they never would have conceived, ways that are incalculably precious. They learn to forgive. They learn to not judge the experience. And they learn to have compassion, not just for themselves, but for their children and the world around them. I think that's the perfect illustration for this mirror. You know, What are our preconceived ideas? What triggers us? And what is inside that we can more align? And we go back to that daily word. I extend forgiveness to myself. We open our hearts, and with love and compassion, we remind ourselves that everyone makes mistakes and deserves understanding and forgiveness, even us. Amen.